Welcome to the Grateful Living Podcast.
Hi, beautiful souls. Welcome back to another episode. So, this is one I've been meaning to record for quite some time because I genuinely believe that this is one of the most important concepts we can understand if we actually want to create lasting change in our lives. It's one of those things that once you understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. You'll understand why two people can experience something similar but respond completely differently. You understand why some people seem to effortlessly stick to habits, whilst others constantly feel like they're starting over. You understand why confidence isn't just something you're born with, and why healing isn't simply about changing your thoughts. Today, we're talking about self-concept. Now, if you've never heard that phrase before, don't worry, because I hadn't either until a few years ago. It's not really something we're taught in schools. We learn about maths, science, English, history, but nobody really teaches us how we can come to see ourselves. And yet that picture we hold of ourselves quite quietly influences almost every single decision we make. I honestly think that's why so many people feel frustrated with personal development. They read books, listen to podcasts, buy the journal, create the vision board, set New Year's resolutions, and for a while, everything feels exciting. They feel motivated. They think this is it. This time it's going to be different. And then a few weeks later, they're back where they started. And maybe you've experienced this yourself. I know I have. Maybe you've promised yourself countless times that you'll start exercising, eating healthier, stop replying to that person who only messages when it's convenient for them, or that you'll charge more for your business, speak up in meetings, and finally apply for that job. Or just, simply start putting yourself first. You know what you need to do. The information isn't the problem. So why does it feel so difficult? For years, I think we were told that the answer was discipline. If you just wanted it enough, you'd do it. If you were motivated enough, you'd stick with it. If you were confident enough, you'd finally go after your goals. But over the last decade or two, psychology and neuroscience have started painting a much more interesting picture. What if your behavior isn't simply driven by motivation? What if it's driven by who you believe you are? That's where self-concept comes in. One of my favorite quotes is from psychiatrist and psychotherapist Maxwell Maltz. He said, "You will act like the sort of person you conceive yourself to be." Think about that for a moment. Not the person you want to be, not the person you pretend to be on social media, not even the person other people think you are. The person you genuinely believe yourself to be. Because those are often two very different things. You might consciously say, "I want to be confident," but underneath that, your self-concept might be saying, "I'm awkward." You might say you want a healthy relationship, but deep down, there's a part of you that believes people always leave. You might desperately want financial freedom, but somewhere along the way, you've picked up the belief that people like me don't make money, or money changes people, or success is for everyone else. The fascinating thing is that these beliefs rarely sit on the surface. They're quiet, automatic, they're so familiar that they don't even feel like beliefs anymore. They feel like facts. I remember having a conversation with a client once who just kept saying, "I'm just not that disciplined." She said it so casually as though she was telling me her eye colour. "I'm just not disciplined." So I asked her, "When did you decide that?" She looked at me completely confused. I didn't decide it. I said, "Well, you must have done at some point because babies aren't born believing that they're disciplined or undisciplined." And we laughed because it's true. A baby doesn't arrive into the world thinking I'm anxious or I'm bad with money or I'm difficult or I'm not lovable. Those ideas have come from somewhere, which brings us to a really important question. Where does our self-concept actually come from? Because if we're not born with it, then it must be learned. And that's exactly what research suggests. From the moment we're born, our brains are absorbing information at an incredible rate. In fact, during early childhood, our brains are particularly plastic, meaning they're incredibly adaptable. They're constantly building neural pathways based on what they're experiencing. As children, we don't really have the ability to question what we're told. If an adult says, "You're so shy," we don't think, well, that's a really interesting opinion. We think, oh, I must be shy. If we're repeatedly praised for being the responsible one, we begin to see ourselves as a responsible one. If we're constantly compared to our siblings, criticized, ignored, or made to feel like our emotions are too much, we start creating meaning around those experiences. Because that's literally how children make sense of the world. Children are meaning-making machines. Let's say a child grows up in a household where one parent is unpredictable. Maybe they're loving one minute and angry the next. Maybe the child learns that keeping the peace makes life easier. They become very aware of everyone else's emotions. They avoid conflict. They apologize even when they haven't done anything wrong. Fast forward 20 years, that person might describe themselves as someone who's just a people pleaser. But were they born a people pleaser? Or was that a survival strategy that eventually became part of their identity? And I think that's something we don't talk about enough because they're very different things. Sometimes we confuse adaptations with personality. We say, that's just who I am, when actually it's who we had to become. That's incredibly empowering because if something was learned, it can also be unlearned. Now, this doesn't mean we blame our parents for everything. I think it's really important to say that because most parents are doing the best they can with the resources, awareness, and experiences that they have themselves. Our self-concept isn't only shaped by our family, it's shaped by school, friendships, teachers, social media, culture, the society we grew up in, repeated experiences, successes, failures, comments people make when they probably don't even remember what they're saying. Have you ever noticed that how one sentence someone says stays with you for years? Someone once tells you you're too sensitive or too loud or not academic or not sporty or that you're intimidating. And before you know it, you've started carrying that sentence around as though it belongs to you. You stop questioning whether it's true and simply start living as though it is. That's the power of identity. And what's really interesting is that once we form these beliefs about ourselves, our brain starts looking for evidence to support them. This isn't because your brain wants to make you miserable. It's because your brain's primary job isn't to make you happy. Its primary job is to keep you safe and to make sense of the world. One of the ways it does this is by creating patterns. Our brains are constantly trying to answer one very simple question. Based on everything I've experienced so far, what should I expect next? It's actually quite incredible when you think about it. Every second, your brain is taking in millions of pieces of information. Every sound, smell, face, conversation, movement around you. If you consciously process all of that, you'd be completely overwhelmed. So instead, your brain filters them. It decides what deserves your attention and what doesn't. One of the systems involved in this is something called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. Don't worry, you don't need to remember the name. The important part is understanding what it does. Think about when someone buys a new car. Maybe they never noticed that particular model before and suddenly it feels like everyone is driving it. The cars were always there, but now the brain has decided that that information is relevant, so it starts noticing it everywhere. The same happens with our beliefs about ourselves. If somewhere along the way you've developed the belief that people don't really like you, your brain becomes incredibly good at collecting evidence to support that story. Someone doesn't text you back straight away, your brain notices. A colleague seems a little quieter than usual, your brain notices. Someone cancels plans, more evidence. But here's what's interesting. On the very same day, someone might compliment you, another friend might messaging asking how you are, and someone else might tell you how much they appreciate you. Those moments often pass straight by us because they don't fit the existing story. It's not that your brain is lying to you, it's filtering. It's saying this is the version of reality that makes sense based on what we already believe. And I find that fascinating because it explains why two people can walk away from exactly the same situation with completely different conclusions. Imagine two people starting a new job. One has the self-concept that I'm capable, I figure things out. The other has the self-concept that says I'm not good enough. They both make the same small mistake during their first week. The first person thinks, that's okay, everyone makes mistakes when they're learning. The second person thinks, I knew it, I'm not cut out for this. Same event, completely different meaning. And it's the meaning we attach to experiences that shapes our future behavior. This is something psychologists often talk about when discussing our self-schema. A self-schema is essentially the mental framework we have about who we are. It influences what we notice, how we interpret situations, and even what we remember afterwards. So when people say, I don't know why I keep ending up in the same situations, it's often because they're unknowingly recreating experiences that reinforce their existing identity. Now, before anyone starts thinking, well, that's a bit depressing, I promise there is some good news coming. Because if your brain can learn these patterns, it can also learn new ones. But before we get to changing them, I think it's important to understand just how powerful identity really is. There's a quote from author James Clear that I've shared before because I think it's brilliant. He says that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you believe yourself to be. Notice he doesn't say every action changes your life overnight. He says it's a vote. Imagine an election. One vote doesn't decide the outcome, does it? But thousands of votes repeated over time eventually create a result. Our habits work in exactly the same way. The problem is so many of us are trying to change our behavior without changing the identity underneath it. We say things like, I'm trying to exercise, I'm trying to meditate, I'm trying to be more confident, I'm trying to stop people pleasing. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that language, but I think it's worth asking ourselves something. Who is doing the trying? Because if underneath all of those goals is a person who still believes I'm lazy, I'm not confident, I'm always going to struggle, then every new habit feels like swimming against the current. It's exhausting. It's why people often describe personal growth as feeling like two parts of themselves are pulling in opposite directions. One part desperately wants to change, the other part wants familiarity. Our brains generally prefer what's familiar over what's unfamiliar, even if the familiar isn't particularly healthy. And I think this is where a lot of self-sabotage comes from. We hear that phrase all the time, don't we? Like, I'm my own worst enemy, I keep sabotaging myself. Personally, I don't love the word sabotage because it makes it sound as though there's something broken about us or that we're consciously trying to ruin our own lives. Most of the time, that's not what's happening at all. It's just that our brain is trying to protect an identity that feels safe because it's known, even if that identity is limiting. Imagine someone who has spent years believing they're not good enough, then suddenly they receive an amazing opportunity, maybe a promotion, or someone wants to invest in their business, or maybe they meet a genuinely kind partner after years of unhealthy relationships. You'd think they'd feel nothing but excitement. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they also feel anxious. They start overthinking, they pull away, they procrastinate, not because they don't want the opportunity, because it doesn't match the identity that they've been carrying. Their nervous system is saying, hang on a minute, we've never lived here before. And I think this is where healing becomes so much more compassionate, because instead of asking ourselves, what's wrong with me, we can start asking, what part of me is trying to keep me safe? That one question changes everything. It moves us away from shame and towards curiosity. And curiosity is where growth begins. This also explains why simply repeating affirmations doesn't often work for people. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think affirmations are inherently bad. I know they've helped some people. But if someone has spent 30 years believing they're unworthy, and they stand in front of a mirror saying, I'm incredibly successful, I'm deeply confident, I love myself completely, sometimes their brain responds with, no, you don't. The gap between the belief and the affirmation is simply too large. That's why I much prefer building identity through evidence rather than just trying to force ourselves to believe something that feels completely disconnected from our current reality. For example, instead of saying, I'm the most confident person in the room, perhaps the evidence is saying, I spoke up in that meeting even though I felt uncomfortable. That's real. Instead of just saying, I'm incredibly disciplined, maybe it's, I went for a 20-minute walk even though I couldn't be bothered. That, again, is evidence. every small action becomes another vote, another piece of proof, another brick in the foundation of that new identity. And over time, something really interesting happens. You stop doing those things because you're forcing yourself, and you start doing them because that's simply who you're becoming. I often think about learning to drive. When you first start, every single action requires conscious effort. You're thinking about the pedals, the mirrors, the gears, your speed, checking your blind spot. It all feels overwhelming. Years later, you can drive somewhere and barely remember the journey because those actions have become automatic. Identity works in a similar way. The more evidence your brain gathers that supports a healthier version of you, the less effort it takes to act in alignment with that version. But there is another piece of this puzzle that I think is often overlooked, especially in traditional personal development, and that's the body. Because we can understand something intellectually and still struggle to live it emotionally, and that's exactly what I want to explore in this next part. Before we continue, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about something I've created. If you've been listening and thinking, I want to become that version of myself, remember that lasting change is often built through small things that we do consistently. And that's exactly why I created the Grateful Living Apothecary. From calming room sprays to simple ritual tools, each product is designed to help you create intentional moments of calm, grounding, and connection throughout your day. Because sometimes changing your self-concept isn't about becoming someone new. It's about creating daily rituals that remind you of who you already want to be. If you'd like to explore the collection, you'll find the link in the show notes. Now, let's get back to the episode. Now, this brings us to something that I think is often missing from conversations about identity and personal development. We spend so much time talking about changing our thoughts, but we don't spend nearly enough time talking about the body. And I think that's one of the reasons so many people become frustrated. Because have you ever noticed that you can know something logically but still not feel it? You know, maybe someone tells you you're doing an amazing job and you hear the words, you know they're saying something kind, but somehow it doesn't land. Or perhaps you've had people tell you you're enough just as you are. Again, logically, you can understand the sentence, but emotionally, something still feels off. And I think we've all experienced that at some point, you know, something in your head, you know it, but your body just hasn't caught up yet. And this is where I think the nervous system deserves a seat at the table. One of the things I've learned through my work, whether that's massage, Reiki, EFT coaching, or simply talking with women every single day, is that our bodies remember experiences just as much as our minds do. Now, I want to be careful with my wording here because people sometimes hear the phrase the body keeps a score and think it means every ache or pain has a psychological cause, and that's not what we're saying. Physical symptoms can have many different causes, and it's always important to seek appropriate medical advice where needed. But what researchers like Bessel van der Kolk or Peter Levine have helped us understand is that difficult or emotional experiences don't just disappear because time passes. Our nervous system adapts, it learns, it remembers. You know, think back to what we spoke about earlier. As children, we don't just learn beliefs, we also learn what feels safe. And if you grew up in an environment where expressing your emotions led to criticism, your nervous system may have learned that staying quiet is safer than speaking up. If love felt unpredictable, your body may have learned to stay hyper aware of other people's moods. If you had to constantly prove your worth through achievement, slowing down might actually feel uncomfortable even when you're exhausted. None of these responses mean that you're broken. You know, they're intelligent adaptations. Your body was doing exactly what it needed to do to help you survive the environment you were in. The problem is that survival strategies don't always make long-term life strategies, you know. What protected you at 10 years old may be limiting you at 30. And this is where I think we need to be incredibly compassionate with ourselves, because so often people say things like, I know I should have better boundaries, or I know I should stop people pleasing, or I know I should leave that toxic situationship. And they judge themselves because they haven't done it yet. But knowing and feeling safe enough to do something are two completely different things. You can know exactly what needs to change and still have a nervous system that perceives that change as dangerous. Let's use a simple example. Imagine someone has spent years putting everyone else first. They're always available, always saying yes, always making sure everybody else is okay before checking in with themselves. Eventually, they decide they're going to start setting boundaries. Sounds great. Except the first time they say no, what happens? Their heart starts racing, their stomach tightens, they feel guilty. Their mind immediately starts saying things like, what if they're upset with me? What if they don't like me anymore? I should just do it. People often think that's a sign that they're doing something wrong. And I actually think it's often a sign they're doing something different. Their nervous system is reacting because unfamiliar doesn't automatically feel safe. It just feels unfamiliar. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions in healing. We assume healing should always feel peaceful. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's incredibly beautiful. But sometimes healing feels uncomfortable because you're asking your brain and your body to stop doing something they've been practicing for years. Imagine you've walked the same path through a field every single day for 20 years. The grass is worn down, the route is obvious. Then one day you decide to walk somewhere completely different. At first it's awkward, the grass is long, you're stepping over uneven ground, it takes more effort. That doesn't mean it's the wrong path, it simply means it hasn't become familiar yet. Your brain works in a very similar way. Every thought you repeatedly think strengthens particular neural pathways. Every behavior you repeatedly perform strengthens those pathways even further. This is something known as neuroplasticity. For a long time, scientists believed that adult brain was relatively fixed. That once we've reached adulthood, this was simply who we were. Thankfully, we now know that that's not true. Our brains remain capable of change throughout our lives. Every new experience, every new skill, every meaningful conversation, every time you respond differently instead of reacting automatically, you're strengthening different neural networks. That doesn't mean change happens overnight. I wish it did. But I actually think there's something reassuring about knowing it's a process, because it means that you're not failing when change feels slow. You're literally asking your brain to build new pathways. That takes repetition. Which brings me back to something I often say in my coaching sessions. Confidence isn't something you find, it's something you build evidence for. The same is true for self-worth, resilience, self-trust. We spend so much time waiting to feel different before we act. I'll apply for the job when I feel confident. I'll speak up when I believe in myself. I'll start the business when I feel ready. But what if those feelings don't come first? What if they come because of the actions you repeatedly take? Not because actions magically transform your life overnight, but because every action gives your brain another piece of evidence about who you are. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you're quietly teaching your brain, I'm somebody who follows through. Every time you rest without apologizing for it, you're teaching your nervous system, I don't have to earn rest. Every time you set that boundary with kindness, you're teaching yourself, I can disappoint someone else without abandoning myself. Those moments might seem insignificant. They're not. They're identity shifts happening in real time. And the beautiful thing is, they begin to accumulate. One small decision probably won't change your life, but thousands of small decisions absolutely can. So we've established that our self-concept isn't fixed, that it's something we've learnt over time. The obvious question becomes, how do we actually begin changing it? Because I think it's really easy to listen to an episode like this and think, oh, that makes sense, but then to go back to living exactly the same way. Awareness is incredibly powerful, but awareness on its own doesn't actually create change. It's what you do with that awareness that matters. For me, I think the first step is becoming curious about the stories you've been carrying around for years without even realizing it. I would genuinely encourage you to sit down with a journal after listening to this episode and ask yourself a simple question. Who do I believe I am? Not who do you want to become or how other people see you, but who do you genuinely believe you are? And just write, don't overthink. You might write things like, I'm always the one people rely on, I'm bad with money, I'm not very disciplined, I'm anxious, I'm the strong one, I never finish what I start. Whatever comes up for you, write it down and then ask yourself another question. Where did I learn that? Notice I didn't say, is it true? Not yet, because sometimes we have to understand where the belief came from before we're ready to challenge it. Maybe you realize you've spent years calling yourself lazy, but actually, growing up, nobody ever taught you how to rest. Every time you sat down, someone accused you of being lazy. So now, every time you rest, guilt appears. That's very different from being a lazy person, or perhaps, you've always been believed that you're difficult. Then you remember being told as a child that you were too emotional, too sensitive, too much. And suddenly you begin to realize maybe that belief was inherited. Maybe it was never actually yours to begin with. And I think that's one of the most freeing parts of healing, realizing that not every thought in your head belongs to you. Some of them were handed to you by family, school, society, by experiences that happened when you were simply trying to make sense of the world. And once you see them, you get to decide whether you want to keep carrying them or not. The second thing I'd encourage you to do is start collecting evidence for the person you're becoming. This is something I speak about quite a lot, especially with my coaching group, because I believe we underestimate how powerful evidence is. Your brain loves proof. If you've spent years believing you're incapable, your brain isn't going to suddenly believe you're unstoppable because you've repeated an affirmation like 10 times. It needs experiences, it needs evidence. Let's imagine you're trying to become somebody who trusts themselves. Instead of waiting until you completely trust yourself, start noticing the moments when you already do. Maybe you honored your needs to rest instead of forcing yourself to keep working. That's evidence. Maybe you said no to something that didn't feel right. That's evidence. Maybe you finally booked that appointment you've been putting off. Evidence. Maybe you posted the video even though you were nervous. Evidence. Tiny moments, huge impact. One thing I used to do, and I still come back to now, is keeping what I call an impact folder or an evidence list. Whenever I did something that was aligned with the person I wanted to become, I'd write it down or I'd take a screenshot, not because I wanted to tick a box, but I wanted my brain to stop overlooking my progress. We're brilliant at collecting evidence for why we're not enough. We're much less practiced at collecting evidence for how far we've actually come. And that's something I think we all need to get better at. The third thing I'd say is be really mindful of the language you use about yourself, because words matter. Because when they're repeated, think about how many times you say things like, I'm so useless, I'm terrible with money, I'm always late, I'm awkward. Now imagine hearing those sentences every single day for years. Eventually your brain stops questioning them and simply files them away as facts. What if instead we become a little more intentional? Not pretending, not lying to ourselves, just describing ourselves more accurately. Instead of saying I'm lazy, maybe it's I'm learning how to become more consistent. Instead of I'm anxious, perhaps it's I'm experiencing anxiety at this moment. Can you hear the difference? One becomes your identity, the other becomes an experience. Experiences change, identities feel permanent. And I think that's a really important distinction. The fourth thing, and this is one that I don't think gets spoken about enough, is looking at your environment. Because whether we like it or not, our identities are shaped by the people around us. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We naturally begin adopting the beliefs, behaviors, and expectations of the groups we spend the most amount of time with. If everyone around you believes that success is impossible, you will probably start believing it too. If everyone around you laughs at personal growth, you'll probably hide that part of yourself. If everyone around you constantly criticizes themselves, eventually self-criticism starts sounding normal. This isn't about cutting everyone out of your life. It's about asking, do the people around me reinforce the version of me I'm trying to leave behind, or the version I'm trying to grow into? Sometimes changing your environment isn't moving house. Sometimes it's changing the conversations you listen to, the books you read, the podcasts you consume, the people you choose to spend time with, because every one of those things is feeding your identity. And finally, I want to leave you with something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I think so many of us approach healing as though we're trying to become someone completely different. We say things like, I just want to become a new person. I actually don't think that that's what healing is. I don't think healing is about becoming someone else. I think it's actually about remembering who you were before the world convinced you to be someone you're not. Before the criticism, the heartbreak, the rejection, the expectations, before all of the stories that slowly became your identity. Maybe healing isn't about adding more. Maybe it's about letting go. Letting go of the beliefs that were never yours. Letting go of the identities that helped you survive but no longer help you live. Letting go of the versions of yourself that have been carrying responsibilities that were never meant to belong to you. Because underneath all of that, I genuinely believe there is still you. Not the perfect version or the healed version or the version of you who has everything figured out, but just you. Whole, worthy, enough. Not because you've earned it or that you've achieved enough, but simply because your worth was never something you had to prove in the first place. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's episode, it's this. Your self-concept may have shaped your past, but it doesn't have to determine your future. The stories you've been telling yourself for the last 10, 20, 30 years might explain why you've become who you are today, but they don't have to dictate who you become next. You get to question them, you get to rewrite them, you get to gather new evidence, you get to teach your brain and your body that a different way of living is possible. And it won't happen overnight. There'll be days when that old version of you feels louder. There will be moments where familiar patterns try to pull you back, and that's okay. That's part of the process. Don't mistake familiarity for truth, and don't mistake discomfort for failure. Sometimes discomfort is simply evidence that you're walking a path you've never walked before. So as you finish listening to today, I want to leave you with one final question. If you no longer believed the story that's been holding you back, who would you be? Not in 5 years' time, not when everything's healed, not when you've got more money or confidence or qualifications. Who would you be today? Because maybe, just maybe, that version of you has been there all along. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share it with someone who needs it and leave a review if you're listening on Spotify. Or send me a message on Instagram. I genuinely read every message and I love hearing what these conversations bring up for you. So until next time, take good care.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at _the_grateful_living.